Okay, everybody. So this is the 15th talk of our WBESS Western Biology Evolution Seminar Series. And today I have the pleasure to have with me David Penteado. David is a PhD student in history in Brazil, so he comes from the same country as I do, and he's going to present some of the work he has done when he was in King's College London recently. I was just chatting with him before we started recording this talk, and I'm very excited to learn all about the project he's going to present to us. So, David, please take it away.
Right, thank you, Matheus. It's a pleasure for me to be here presenting this work. As Matheus explained it, I'm not, uh, I don't have any formal training in biology, but I do have a deep passion for biology, especially for evolution. And this paper I'll be presenting here was published in the Journal History of Biology in 2023, and it covers I think the fundamental issue here is artificial selection and how different scientific theories were attempting to achieve artificial selection to different rationales. So the title of the paper is Buffon's theory of animal degeneration and the regeneration forces in mid-19th century Brazil. Um, my research uh, usually focus on history of science and environmental history, and this is one of those examples. Is a paper that cross between history of biology, and environmental history too, as we be seeing very soon. So, the fundamental issue here is artificial selection. As we know, artificial selection here is the process by which humans use animal breeding or plant breeding, in this case, animal breeding, to selectively develop particularly phenotypic traits by choosing which animals or plant males and females will reproduce and have offspring together. And here we're talking about a period before evolution, before Darwin, before the publication of the Origin of Species. These the events I'll be talking in this presentation is from the mid-19th century. So the long 19th century was a period of many developments in animal biology, where livestock improvement became a complex enterprise, with the search for the most effective technique becoming complex and also of deep interest for economic actors. By the middle of the century, however, while notions of heredity became the dominant foundation for animal husbandry, the paper argues that policies for livestock improvement in Brazil were tailored following a climate deterministic concept established in the mid-18th century by the French naturalist, the Count of Buffon. Buffon is, I want to say, after Darwin, Lamarck, Buffon is a very famous individual in the history of biology due to the publication of his history. I'm gonna just say in English. My French is terrible. Natural History, which was a massive encyclopedia where he attempts to compiles where he attempts to compile the knowledge, the natural history knowledge of everything from rocks, animals, and it was a highly influential book. And although it was published by the mid 18th century up to the late 18th century, it remained highly influential all the way up to the mid of the next century, as we'll be seeing here. The larger context of the history within the history of evolutionary thought is that animal husbandry does not receive as much attention as other subjects. And I want to make an effort here to integrate this into this into the history of natural selection and evolution. Within the Darwinian concept of natural selection, the concept was strongly influenced by Darwin's observation of the change that could be effected through artificial selection. Darwin wrote several papers, wrote very several pages about how easy animal and plant breeders could accomplish to have in the animals and plants offspring the traits that they needed and the traits that they wanted. And also the second most important concept here is environmental determinism. We often know this concept as climate deterministic and climate determinism, and I want to point out the difference here, because whereas climate refers only to what we understand as a climate, the long-term patterns of weather, environmental determinism accounts for a broader definition. Here on the right, I can summarize, at least within the concept, within the context of Buffon, what it means for animal and human species to be influenced by the weather. Here it takes into account the soil quality, the food, the topography, the altitude, and of course, as any historian of science from this early modern period would know, the presence of swamps, which was deemed to be highly detrimental to health. But also, as historians of science will also know, hypotheses regarding the perverse influence of the climate and environment on the development, livelihood, and qualities of non-humans, animals, and humans are as old as the history of Western thought. Since Aristotle, Plato, all the first geographers, the first physicists, the first doctors, they all had a deep understanding, a deep belief that the climate and the environment as a whole was acting upon individuals, both animals and humans alike. And of course, another long-standing idea within biology was the notion of inheritance of acquired characteristics, which I'm certain there is no need to explain this, is the idea that there is this overlapping between germline cells and somatic cells, where the changes that the individuals go through their lives, they can pass down to their offspring, therefore violating the Weismann barrier that as became known in the 20th century. But here, before evolution, before Weismann barrier, this is a given. The inheritance of acquired characteristics is a given for anyone, for any naturalist, for anyone who was thinking about biology. They would assume that to be true, and that is the case here. But something changed in the late 18th century to the early 19th century. In this new age, a shift occurred towards placing racial constancy and the influence of the kinship above that of the natural environment. There were several examples, several successful enterprises that led to this outcome. We have a good experience with English thoroughbred, which is a breed of horses by the mid-18th century, and later on the late part of the century, the introduction of the Spanish Merino sheep across Europe and North America. Those successful enterprises were moving in a specific breed to a location that was different from what was perceived to be their natural habitat, and that breed staying the same, that breed, quote unquote, not degenerating, gave a greater confidence for animal breeders that the influence of the environment was not inevitable. The influence of the kinship, the influence of their parents, of the animal parents, could be greater than the influence of the environment. And this is a very significant change in biology before Darwin that, as I was explaining earlier, also influenced Darwin in his writing of in his development of the theory of natural selection. So here we have this change, but in the early 19th century. But how is that relevant? So as I was talking earlier, presenting Buffon's work, Buffon was a highly influential and a highly famous naturalist by the mid-18th century. The publication of his natural history encyclopedia was a huge success and was one of the most read books in Europe at the time of its publication. And one of the most famous theories that he put forward in his book was the idea of animal degeneration. And here I want to make a footnote here that there is an idea of the biogeographical degeneration, which is the idea that the Americas, the New World, the continent of the America was inferior, environmentally speaking, to Europe in Africa and Asia in that regard. But this is not what I'm talking about. It's a different idea. Here, I'm just referring to animal degeneration, which is the idea that all animal species were subject to limited yet inheritable transformations in response to the climate. So whenever an species, let me start over. Each animal species had an original habitat, had a natural habitat where that species was made to live, according to Buffon. And if that species were to be moved to a different location, they would suffer degeneration. And degeneration here is they would lose the traits that were most suited to their natural habitat. But there was a solution for them. Buffon also posited that whereas this degeneration would always be occurring, it could be improved if through animal breeding and artificial selection, here known as selective breeding. And here give an example, which is also the same example that Buffon gives in his book. Imagine if we were to move Spanish horses to France, to the country of France, which has a different environment. According to Buffon, those horses would suffer degeneration. They would degenerate into French horses. They would lose the traits that Spanish horses are known for. So in order for you to keep the Spanish horses in France, to still be Spanish, you would have to keep bringing new Spanish horses, have them breed with your horses that are in France, so they could keep the Spanish traits of the horse. And this would have to be done indefinitely, because the influence of the environment here, Buffon posits that the most significant aspect of this environmental influence is the climate. The influence of the French climate is something you cannot stop. And this was a highly popular idea. although it was already based on ideas that were already accepted by animal breeders, which was at the time, the mid 18th century, that which was the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So this is the idea we're talking about. This is the idea that I will argue in this paper that was attempted to be applied in Brazil. As you were saying that about the example of the French and the Spanish horses, Buffon pointed to the need for crossbreeding alongside consideration of indigenous climates and those to which they were transported. So what was happening to Brazilian horses that require the introduction of this Buffonian approach? Actually, we don't know much what was going on in Brazil with Brazilian horses at the time, but by mid-19th century, politicians, farmers, the military they were all complaining that the horses were generally smaller and more prone to be sick when compared to other horses. They proposed several ideas of why the horses were going through those problems, and they just refer to the combination of those problems as degeneration. The horses, compared to how the horses were decades ago, the horses were degenerating. And the examples that they gave was smaller sizes, they were prone to diseases, and higher mortality rates. In order to address this problem, here we have the first point in this timeline of events. The Brazilian government hires a French veterinarian. By the way, we're talking about the very beginning of the veterinarian sciences, which was in France, and we're talking about like a second generation of veterinarians, which was the French veterinarian Felix Vogele, and also a son of a veterinarian, so he could go to Brazil and make an assessment of why the horses were presenting those problems. Now, why horses matter in this context here? And here is just in a historical addendum, because I think it's important for us who have little to no contact with horses in 2025. Why does it matter? So in 19th century Western society, the utilization of the horses was ubiquitous. And this was no different in Brazil. Horses were a fundamental component of Brazilian economy and society. And at the time, calls for government intervention in matters related to horse breeding and extra interventions were not out of ordinary in Europe and the Americas. There was a widespread concern from governments with the number and quality of horses, particularly those used by the military. And you can find in the literature all kind of schemes developed by central governments to improve and acquire more horses, to improve horse breeding. But here there's a difference, because whereas there were many different schemes to improve horse quality and numbers, Brazil seemed to have attempted something different. And here we go to the core of this research, which is their Brazilian attempt to regenerate the Brazilian horses. And we go to the second point of this timeline, which is the publication of the book, Essay on the Regeneration of Horse Breeds in the Empire of Brazil, published in 1856, roughly at the same time that the French veterinarian was being hired. And the book was published by the then director of the Brazilian National Museum. He was trained as an engineer, but he had also deep interest natural history, and is actually known in Brazil as a naturalist. But despite this curriculum of his, the proposal that he puts forward in his book is that the only way to solve the degeneration problem was the recurrent acquisition of stallions, which in other words, horses for procreation, the recurrent acquisition of stallions of overseas breed to serve as a local breeding stock, thus renewing the local species. And here we have, throughout the book, he gonna make direct references to Buffon book and also use his theoretical foundation to corroborate his own. He have a quote from the book where he clearly endorses the Buffonian idea of that all animals are degenerating, and the only way that the race can be renewed is through crossbreeding. And I think this is an aspect that I might have overlooked when explaining Buffon theory of the animal degeneration. The only way an animal species, according to Buffon, can strive, can be successful, it can avoid degeneration is through crossbreeding. And crossbreeding here is breeding with a different breed. So if you have an animal, a different, and if you have a specific breed that only breeds with its own and does not engage in crossbreeding, it will degenerate, according to Buffon. And here the solution is to crossbreed, and it serves a dual purpose. First, Burlamark's scheme not only would address this issue by introducing crossbreeding, by importing horses from elsewhere, and also to attempt to improve the local horses condition by renewing the sap of their race. Let me read a quote. All species of land animals degenerate and wither from generation to generation. If the sap of the races is not renewed from time to time, in horses breeding, this degeneration is perhaps more rapid than any other. And here there is like a small schematics of how this scheme works alongside with what was the perception of the problem. So animals first start here at the top gray. The animals lose original traits due to inbreeding and climate effects. Climate is the most important factor for degeneration in animals. And here on red, the generational effects. Each generation suffers more from degeneration due to the inheritance of acquired characteristics. But this can be ameliorated, this can be improved with recurrent crossbreeding with animals from different and ideally opposite climates. And by using crossbreeding, you're gonna restore the original traits. And you're gonna, yeah, as you can tell, this is a circle because there is no ultimate solution. You cannot stop degeneration altogether. It only serves as a stopgap until you have to do this all over again. It doesn't specify neither Buffon nor Borlamark, which is the author of the book here, specifies what is the time interval that you have to import foreign animals for crossbreeding, but every couple of years is supposed to be the ideal hiatus for the scheme. So surprisingly, no, perhaps unsurprisingly, because Burlemark, the author of the book, was a highly influential individual, and his scheme to have the horses imported, to have them crossbreed with Brazilian horses, was approved. And 2 batches of horses were imported from Europe and Africa, respectively. So between 1857 and 1859, the Brazilian government acquired 2 batches of horses, of stallions, the first from the region of Germany and the second from Algeria. And also here, there's a footnote here because I will not be covering this. In the following years, a similar scheme was created to improve hogs in Brazil. So as you can see, the first batches of horses were quite, the first 2 batches and only 2 batches of horses were kind of small. You have 12 stallions imported from the region of Germany and 13 stallions imported from Algeria. They were all transported to the southeast of Brazil, and they were supposed to be given to specific farmers so the results could be tested. But the argument I'm putting forward here is that idea, the Buffonian idea of crossbreeding and animal degeneration, was already outdated by the time it was proposed. By the mid-19th century, it was very well established that races, breeds would be constant, would remain the same despite environmental influence, and then the influence of the kingship, the influence of the blood, was stronger than the environment. And at the time, there was some backlash from against Burlemark's idea of importing horses in order to improve Brazilian horses. So the first one was a publication of a book by a journalist. He was of French origin, and also aimed to be a scientific manual for horse breeders. He called, at the time, he's gonna call Burlemark's proposal a radically erroneous system, the son of hypotheses most contrary to scientific data and disproved by experience, and blame Buffon for this misconception. Later, the French veterinarian that was previously hired by the Brazilian government called it the program of importing horses a waste of time and money. So even at their time, there was opposition to this scheme. It went, even though it was approved regardless. But what did those 2 individuals propose instead? And here I made a very short table to highlight the differences between the approach that was used by the Brazilian government as proposed by Burlemark, and what is the standard approach that was put forward by Carlos Emile Haddad and Felix Vogelli, which was the French veterinarian. And I say standard because by going to the literature of the time, because as I was explaining earlier, that it was very widespread for governments to be concerned about horses. The causes for the horse degeneration problem in Brazil, as assessed by Haddad and Vogelli, was poor animal nutrition and poor training of the animal handlers. Let me explain how poor training of the horses. And the solutions was the creation of veterinary schools to build and establish horse stud farms and to improve agriculture in order to improve the animal nutrition. As opposed to Burlemark's approach, which the only solution here highlighted in orange was the importation of stallions. Here he made some extra remarks of what could also help, but the only solution to this climate-induced degeneration was the importation of foreign stallions. Here, going to be moving to the conclusion of the paper. About what is the relevance of this paper here, especially for the history of biology. The first one I can highlight here is the persistence of the deterministic climate notions. The idea that the climate was this all-powerful, almighty force that was outside human affairs. I think my headset went out. All right. No, I'm back now.
Yeah,
I'm back
David.
now.
Yeah, I wasn't sure whether it was my computer or on your end. Yeah. So now I can hear you. Thank you.
I'll start over from the conclusion here. So the first highlight I can make here is about the relevance of this paper, is how important and persistent were the idea that the climate and the environment as a whole was this almighty almighty force that was outside human control, and they had to resort to accept that animals would degenerate if they were moved outside their natural habitat, what was perceived to be the natural habitat. And also here, in the specific context of Brazil and Latin America, how influential Buffon was. And now in the broader sense is the issue of scientific adoption lag and communication. In a time before internet, in a time before fast communication, where the only resources that scientists and policymakers could have to access the latest scientific theories was through the trade of books and correspondence. And they were prone to have delays, especially given especially when big distances are considered sorry. And countries on the periphery of scientific production, as was Brazil at the time, might adopt or maintain outdated theories longer than core regions. And there are many examples of that issue of scientific adoption lag and communication. We have in the Soviet Union a delay on adopting genetic theory, and even when you're considering in underdeveloped countries, how they still might struggle with teaching of evolution. And lastly is the intersection between science and politics. And here also, no, we can think of many not so far ago examples of that. Biological theories were entangled with the national development agendas. Here, Brazil was trying to solve what seems to be actually for this research, as far as my research went, there was indeed a problem with horses in Brazil. But due to the issues that I have highlighted, it seems that they were relying on what is now known, was already by them outdated scientific theories. At the time that Paul Lamarck's book was published, it was very well established that animal races or animal breeds would remain constant if they were moved to places that were perceived not to be their natural habitats. And I think that is all. Here there's a QR code for the paper. If anyone is interested, there's much more information there on the paper about other animal species that were also part of this scheme to regenerate animal species in Brazil. And I would like to thank also the Sao Paulo Research Foundation for funding this research.
Thank you, David. During all your talk, I mean, I have several questions to begin with, but during your talk, I was thinking, what a clear example of how evolution and evolutionary thought and evolutionary theory and thinking, how it permeates all aspects of our lives, right? We often don't think about it. I think people, consider evolution, particularly because we talk about theory of evolution, so people also have some misunderstandings there with the term theory of evolution. But on top of that, I think folks mostly think of evolution as being something that pertains just to academia and academics, that is something that is not applicable to our daily lives. And your research really shows that, like you said, the importance of the intersection between policies and scientific thought and theories. So yeah, thank you very much for sharing this wealth of knowledge with us today. This was great. This was great. Well, so I do have a few questions, as I said, and I wrote down here, it's questions slash comments. The first comment that I actually have, and you addressed it already, is this idea of timing, right? Because when, for instance, when Bullamark published his book in Brazil, that was just 3 years before Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, right? And I was thinking, I was like, wow, at that time, Darwin had already visited Brazil and the whole South America and collected all the evidence he needed to put together the idea of evolution by natural selection. And like you addressed, by the end of your talk, you said, look, countries that are in the periphery of the scientific production at that time took much longer to catch up, of course, because of we didn't have internet at the time and other fast means of science distribution. You're right. I mean, I was thinking, like, boy, these guys were not, in touch with what was happening in England, at least, right? So it was very telling when I paid attention to the dates, and I was like, wow, that's very telling. Now, another thing that I also found very interesting, this is more of a comment as well. Going back to the idea that, species and animal breeds will degenerate inevitably, right? When they're not in touch with their original habitats. And then the only solution that Buffon had proposed was to keep on bringing, the original breed to, I guess, bring the good phenotype, the good genes, if you will. I think there is some sort of, uh, I guess, real biological reason for that. I think, Buffon might have touched upon inbreeding depression, right? We know that, smaller populations, depending on their constitution, we do have inbreeding depression. So I also found that very telling. I liked that idea that there was some sort of overlap with what perhaps Buffon was noticing and what actually might be happening in some populations, right? But of course, he got wrong the reasons for it.
I want to add a comment to your comment because I don't want to be throwing shade at Buffon. And like Buffon has amazing insights on biology.
Yeah.
There are several researchers that have point out some overlapping about Buffon's ideas and how they overlap with Darwin's later ideas on natural selection. They'll but of course there were some fundamental mistakes about Buffon's approach to the improvement to livestock improvement. But indeed, Buffon has amazing insights and on how like natural history works.
Mm, mhm. Yeah, in fact, there is a recent book called Every Living Thing. You might have heard of. I forgot the name of the author, but the book was published last year, and it talks about Buffon and Linnaeus. And if you haven't read, I highly recommend, and I recommend anyone watching this talk to check out Every Living Thing because it's really good and it shows how Buffon, like you mentioned, had touched upon already. He was ahead of his time in terms of evolutionary thoughts, right? So yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I'm right there with your interpretation as well. Another thing you already addressed as well was curious about was the time scale because I was thinking, okay, these guys are reporting that, horse breeds in Brazil are degenerating, right? So they are smaller, they get sick more often, they're not as, strong or as vigorous as the original breeds in Europe or elsewhere. And I was thinking, what time scale we're talking about, right? Are we talking about a few generations, decades? But it's like you said, they never really addressed how regularly the original breed should be brought in, right?
Yes, I think it is a problem with Buffon's approach as well because I have read the original on the natural history, and he never touched upon like how often do I need to like
Mm,
do this recurrent crossbreeding in order to keep my the breed that I have healthy and to keep the traits that I want preserved. He never touched upon this upon this question, and I think Borlamark there was dealing with the literature that they had at the time, which was I'm no doubt that he had natural history, um, because he made direct quotes from Buffon's natural history in his book.
mhm,
But also one more time scale here. I think is worth adding here that this issue of horses in the Americas or even in Asia, the degenerating were quite common. Degeneration was a word they used for everything. Everything they didn't like the 19th century. In the 19th century, degeneration was a very common word. It later on was going to be used for human degeneration, but this is not even not relevant here. But there are reports of horses just losing their traits, becoming weaker, feebler in North America, in the Philippines, um, and it seems like the core issue here isn't as much as horses is struggling to adapt, like the biological entities, the horses is trying to adapt to a new environment, and more like the people that were handling the horses lacking the training and the proper means to take care of the horses.
mhm. Oh, yeah, I can't imagine that. That's for sure. Yeah. Um, Another question that I had is that have you found any recollection of, well, you just mentioned, that degeneration was a common term and it was actually used to describe similar phenomena with horses in North America and parts of Asia. But thinking about Latin America and thinking about, like you said so many times, horses were fundamental for the development of societies at that time. Particularly, right, like if you were exploring uncharted territory, how are we gonna go, the means of transportation is on the back of horses. What about descriptions of, you know, race degeneration in other places like other countries in Latin America? Did we have reports of that as well? I don't know, in Argentina,
I mean, race as in animal species or humans?
no, 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 animal species. We're talking about horses. So what about
All right.
horse breeds in other countries in South America?
Well,
Other,
I did find some reports of horse degeneration in other Latin American countries, especially actually I remember seeing from Cuba, from in the region
mm,
of the Caribbean. Uh, but they did not seem to be as serious of an issue as was in Brazil. it didn't reach to a level where the government was going out of their way to affect change to attempt to address the issue. But there were many other examples where it did not specific in Latin America. It might have some cases just didn't come across, but this importation of foreign breeds of different breeds was a very ordinary occurrence in the 19th century. I mentioned the merino sheep. The merino sheep wasn't like a very popular, became very popular breed all over the planet to have merino sheep importing to your country because the wool was highly valued. But here specifically in Latin America, yes, I came across some reports of horse degeneration, but they do not seem to be as serious as to require government intervention.
Very interesting point. So perhaps, in fact, you know, like we discussed earlier, perhaps in Brazil we did have a case of inbreeding depression, right? And that might not have happened in other countries at the time. So that's very interesting. Or alternatively, the Brazilian government was large enough to notice it, and someone there thought of addressing it.
I
Yeah,
think
very.
what I forgot to say is how did the scheme end? How did the regeneration scheme end? Because I mentioned there were only two batches of horses that were imported to Brazil, and then suddenly there was some other animal species like hogs that were also some breeds that were imported from England this time. But then suddenly stops, the funding ceases, and there is no explanation of why. Uh,
Interesting.
there, there is no, the government doesn't come back saying like we changed our approach. But as I explained in the paper, late in the next decade, we're talking about now like the 1860s. The government now was spending money on establishing veterinary schools, on and the training of specialists to take care of the horses.
They took the
Now,
right approach to that, which is
they,
good.
they, they, they suddenly took a different approach without acknowledging they were doing so.
Interesting. Very interesting. Very interesting knowledge, let me tell you. I think it's fascinating. It's so important to, have this historical knowledge because history explains where we are and it helps us kind of expect where to go. So I think it's fascinating. Thank you for sharing all of this.
My
Um,
pleasure.
I have one last question because, and this is going to show how little knowledge I have of history, because you mentioned at the beginning of your talk that the presence of swamps was something I think you mentioned something like, oh, historians will know how important this is in the debate. I'm assuming then, like you mentioned, the swamps were considered to be unhealthy. Is that right? Like, could you
Yes,
expand on that?
yeah, I can. I should say like historians of science and medicine because of the miasma
Mm.
theory.
Oh, okay.
Uh, since until Pasteur,
Oh,
miasma
yeah.
theory was very prevalent, and swamps were known for their exhaling bad air, and
Interesting.
the the presence of swamps was directly related to epidemics, to in this case degeneration, and especially here with talking about Buffon. Buffon points as at the apparent, I have no research to back it up, apparent uh, unusual quantity of swamps in America, in the continent of America, to justify his argument that America was environmentally inferior to the Europe.
Wow, very interesting.
Yeah, but
Very good stuff.
it goes back to miasma theory.
hmm Okay. Well, thank you for that explanation. Uh, David, I think, we've covered, of course, we could talk more about it, but I think for for this talk. We've covered enough ground. Thanks again for agreeing on, participating in the series and sharing your knowledge with us. This was very insightful, and I do hope, and I will make an intentional effort to bring more historians of science to this series, because again, I think I don't think I know history is very important for us to understand, and we need to bring that knowledge to scientists, and especially, and I think because evolutionary biology is a historical discipline in itself inherently, right? We need to give this historical analysis as well. So thank you again for being here with me today.
Right. Thank you very much, Matthias, for the invitation. It was a pleasure was mine. And
Wonderful. And I also liked that you shared a QR code for folks to find your
yes, let
paper.
me keep this up here, like in case no the other paper is open access, so no need for help.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's a good slide to end on. Okay, so stop the recording now. Okay. Thanks again, David.
Thanks, Matthias.